Okay,
Um, Hi,
awesome.
everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to be in conversation with Phil Vassell this evening. And as some of you may know, this is a part of our June Speaker Series. And so this is our second conversation this month. So we're really excited to be bringing forth this programming. This event is brought to you by Building a Black Archive, which is also known as BABA. Um, and my name is Alana Johnson, and I am one of the co-founders of the project. We're a grassroots community archival initiative dedicated to building Black archives in Canada. So tonight's event is generously supported by the Ontario Trillium Foundation through the Youth Opportunity Fund and Outreach. So we're really grateful for that support. Um, and we'd also like to do a land acknowledgement at this time. So we acknowledge that even though Building a Black Archive has been operating in the digital space and building our archive throughout these last few months, today's event was conceived on these lands, which are the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nation, and is home to many Indigenous peoples. At this time, we'd also love to send some love and reverence to Indigenous communities across Canada, as you know, the heartbreaking news of the discoveries of unmarked graves from the Kamloops residential schools has been circulating, and they're in our thoughts and our prayers. So more about this evening. This evening, we're happy to have Phil Vassell with us to speak about the impact of Word magazine, a legendary publication that came out of the city at a really, fundamental time for hip hop in Canada. So we're really excited to have him here. Just a short bit of his bio. Phil Vassell is the artistic director of the Saga City Music Festival and Conference, and the executive director of the Toronto Urban Music Festival, which produced TUMF and the Irie Music Festival. He is the co-founder and publisher of Word Magazine, Canada's award-winning Black culture magazine, which was published successively from 1992 to 2012. Very impressive. Phil is a Harry Drum Award winner for excellence in business in the year 2000 for Word Magazine, alongside his wife, Donna McCurvin, who wasn't able to be here this evening, but we send love to her. Without a further ado, I'll pass it off to my co-founder, John Savajabi, and she will get the conversation going.
Thank you so much, Alana, for that introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you most importantly to Phil for joining us this evening.
Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So we're going to get started. So Phil, one of the themes, and everyone else is here, one of the themes that we're working on this year for BABA is themed around hip hop and the Black experience in Ontario. So we've been looking at the periods of the late 80s, like 1988, 89, going into the late 2000s, so like ending around 2009, 2010. So one of the first questions I wanted to ask you, Phil, was as a young Black man coming up in those times, the 80s and going into the early 90s before Word, what was the climate like for Black folks in Ontario, if you can remember, at that time?
Well, I think, looking back at, those times, certainly, and I'm going to talk about my own perspective,
Mm-hmm.
because I think, there are a lot of people that I remember who, went to post-secondary institutions, college, university, and there was a sense of optimism. There's a great deal of optimism, despite, what some of the challenges were. And there were many of those, but I think that general sense that, Toronto was becoming, a special place in terms of Black culture and other cultures that were intersecting with it. Um, Reggae was happening. We were starting to see some, concerts. I remember one of the guys, well, there were a couple of guys that were doing things at the time. Keith Baker from KAB Productions. I remember him bringing Luther Vandross to Maple Leaf Gardens.
Oh.
There was also Jonathan Ramos, who was the hip hop promoter at that point, along with the kind of stuff that we later saw, um, with Ron Nelson. I think Ron Nelson preceded
Yeah.
Ramos, but you were starting to see, you know, an energy building and people becoming more confident and willing to take some chances. Um, and so I was a part of that, scene. And at that time, I was also doing a radio show on CIUT-FM, which gave me a lot of access to music, gave me a lot of access to people that I wanted to interview. And so, you know, that meant going out to a lot of shows because I had a fairly popular show. That meant having access to the emerging culture and the buzz and the excitement that was building in Toronto at that time. I think, some of you may have seen, I think it was Nelson George who produced a documentary about the Brooklyn Renaissance, in terms of filming guys like Spike, the arts, music, and all that sort of stuff that was bubbling at the time
Mhm.
in New York. And we had our own, parallel scene that was happening here. And so, like I said, there was a lot of excitement in terms of the culture.
Yeah.
And so that was fertile soil that you could do things with.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's interesting that you mentioned that renaissance that was happening in Toronto parallel to like what was happening in Brooklyn. Like there, we definitely saw that there was a lot of Black cultural production happening in the diaspora at that time. I want to fast forward a little bit to 1992 because as we were talking about in our sessions with our cohort, it seemed like 1992 in Ontario was like a catalyst moment for the Black community. You had like the Young Street uprising and a lot of youth and things like that. There was a lot of young people trying to like build up themselves and build up their arts practice and express themselves especially in a society that constantly misunderstood them. So but also that was the year you founded Word Magazine with Donna. So I wanted to know what led you in 1992 to found Word Magazine?
I think one of the things that I should say about that is that, I was really passionate, still am, even though I no longer practice journalism per se. But I was very passionate about journalism. I'd worked at Contrast while attending U of T. I worked at the radio station at U of T. I was their first advertising manager. I started uh, a date book, a SAC date book, Student Administrative Council date book, and date timer. So I was getting my hands in a lot of different things at that time, and just feeling the energy, feeling the sense that you know things are possible.
Mhm.
And I had worked at CBC the previous 5 years at CBC National TV News, and got to a point there where I worked as a reporter, I worked as a researcher, I worked as a chase producer. Um, Went to work in Windsor, Ontario,
Mhm.
and spent, I think, about 8 months there before coming back to CBC at 6. Worked in CBC News World, was doing weekend work at CBC at 6. So like there were all these amazing things that was going on. And, a year before that, I got married
Mhm.
And while Donna and I were on vacation in Brazil, we started sitting down and planning and plotting what we're going to be doing next.
Mhm.
Um, and that's where the conversation about Word Magazine came up. And we had to deal with it because of what I had also experienced being in Brazil and learning about Afro Brazilian culture or Brazilian culture in general, which is heavily, heavily influenced
Mhm.
by Afro Brazilians. And there was that sense of possibility coming back that, if we wanted to, have our say and put our voice to the mix,
Mhm.
then, looking around, there was Share and Pride and those kinds of publications. But in all honesty, I didn't think those publications were speaking as directly to me and my generation as much as it spoke to my parents' generation. Um, and being a fan of um, some alternative magazines like The Village Voice, which to me was, you know, a great, great model for Word Magazine. I decided that, this is something I could do. The
Mhm.
kind of stories that I was working on at CBC television, yes, I understand there's a role for that, but they weren't the most excitable things that you could get me to work on.
Mhm.
You know, I wanted to explore Black culture. I just come back learning so much about Brazilian culture and Black people's role in that,
Mhm.
and the kind of stuff that was going on here in Toronto. And I said, you know what? I'd spent some time working on contrast, so I had a sense of what goes into a publication. And I had a great mentor there by the name of Clint Albino. So Don and I said, hey, if ever there was a time to take a chance, having just gotten married,
Mhm.
now's the time. And so I basically came back from my honeymoon, and this was in 1991. And I said to the executive director at CBC at the time, you know, I think I'd like to start a magazine. And of course, you get the raised eyebrow when you come in with bright ideas
Right.
like this. I mean,
Right.
you got a job. What are you talking about?
Mhm.
And so, he was gracious enough. David Bazay was gracious enough to say, look, we encourage you to get, a diverse set of experiences, and, hopefully that will make you a better journalist. And he was saying all the things I was hoping he would say.
Mhm.
And, I got a year leave of absence from CBC. And, Donna and myself um, started Word with a friend of mine and a couple of friends of mine, actually. One was Garth Hardy, who was an excellent editor. We're still in touch to this very day. And another friend of mine, Iggy Pitt. And we were the initial team. And it just, I remember we had our first interview, and that interview was a big get because it was the director of Boys in the Hood who
Mm.
spoke to us, and it was an exclusive interview that we'd gotten at the time. And we also had something there dealing with Nelson Mandela
Right.
and Botha in terms of the whole apartheid struggle
Right.
that was going on. So here we were being able to connect with this groundbreaking film and its director, Boys in the Hood, and then be able to deal with the whole anti-apartheid movement that was, going on in the 80s. And I was there when I remember a gentleman from our community grabbed a mace and threw it at the ambassador from South Africa. I mean, there was a lot of things going on, a lot of energy. So here I'm thinking if I want to create something similar to um, the Village Voice out of New York, all the ingredients were there,
Right.
you know. And so we decided, look, let's do this. If it falls on its face after a year, no harm. I'll just have expanded my experiences and would have become a better journalist going back to CBC. And so a year came by and we said, we're not walking away. I got a call, as a matter of fact, from David, the executive director at the time. And he was like, so Phil, when you're coming back to join us? And I said, David, I really can't.
Mm.
I wouldn't feel comfortable just walking away from my dream. And his response was great. He says, well, look, I understand. Um, I appreciate, why you got to do this, but know this, that the tent will always be open for you when you're ready to come back, if you come back.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was the nicest thing anybody could ever say to me as I'm embarking on this wild-eyed dream of creating a Black culture magazine that wouldn't just deal with music, but it would deal with the arts. It would also deal with socio-political stories and issues of the day that we felt we had a unique voice and a unique way of saying it. And moreover, coming from a bunch of young Black um, creatives
Mm-hmm.
and young Black journalists, um, it made it exciting because we were finding our own voice. Everybody was finding their own voice. The illustrators, the photographers, the writers, the editors. I mean, there was a buzz after we dropped our first issue, and the first issue, I think, gave people a pretty good sense as to where we were going with this.
Mm-hmm.
And we started getting phone calls of people wanting to write for this publication. And, Word a year later just couldn't, shut down. I didn't feel like I could ever be honest with myself walking away from that.
Right.
And that's how it that's how it grew.
That's so interesting that you were mentioning a lot about energy and how there was so much energy at that time. We felt like Canadian hip hop had a lot of energy to it as well during that time. So I'm curious to know, as a publisher, how were you viewing Canadian hip hop, like folks like Maestro Fresh West or Mitchie Me or the Dream Warriors? Like, how were you viewing it from that lens? And how did you want to use word to amplify the Canadian hip hop scene at that time?
That's a very good question, and my answer to you and to those who are listening in, um, we felt we could hang our hats on representing, hip hop that was coming out of Toronto.
Mhm.
Nobody else was doing it. You know what I mean? And as I said, if we were the voice of that generation that we're trying to speak to, then we have to reflect what that generation is doing as well. And musically, there was an energy here. There was a lot of influence from south of the border. A lot of times, the first country that those people would travel to, those rappers, would be to Toronto.
Mhm.
And that was their foreign international experience.
Mhm.
So we were very close to what was going on in New York, Detroit. You know, so for me, it was like, here's a chance to give a voice to those artists. Dream Warriors became an international success
Yes.
before they were embraced here. They were blowing up in Europe when North America as a whole was just starting to appreciate them. Maestro at one point actually went to live in New York and then came back here.
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And there are writers that I know as well that worked for us that attempted to go to New York, to get that big break and came back to Toronto and decide, hey, I'm going to rep for this city. This is where I live. This is where I am. And there were things going on here as well. So to me, hip hop became a central piece of what we were going to do as Word Magazine. We weren't saying that it was the only piece.
Right.
Um, I, as an individual, felt that we have to reflect the Black diaspora that was here in Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
And Toronto was becoming the most culturally diverse city on the planet. So if we were forward looking as a publication, if I was forward looking as an editor, I'd have to embrace that. It wasn't difficult because that's who I was. I wanted to be able to write about an African artist. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I wanted to be able to write about a jazz artist. I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be able to write about a soca artist, most definitely a reggae artist because of my heritage. I'm a Jamaican Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
So those things became part of the fabric of what Word represented, and it wasn't like anything else. It wasn't like Now, it wasn't like iWeekly, those
Right.
publications that were there, and it certainly wasn't like Share or Pride or the Camera or those publications that were coming out. We were charting our own course,
Mm-hmm.
and we had a great bunch of people that, you know, bought into the idea and understood that this was our chance to express ourselves, and Word became the platform through which they were able to express themselves.
Yeah,
So I
no.
think I think my answer, is that yeah, hip hop was part of it, but if you go back and take another look in terms of what was going on, the theater scene, there were a lot of young Black actors, actresses, playwrights, that were starting to do things. Writers were starting to make their voices heard. So hip hop was perhaps the one that most people became aware of,
Yeah.
but it didn't stay there.
Yes.
Okay, it was bigger than that. It
Mm-hmm.
was broader than that, and that's why I talk about the energy got translated into different artistic ways. Visual artists became a big thing, and we got to feature some of the local visual artists, photographers like Michael Chambers and
Mm-hmm.
Patrick Wilson, Patrick Nichols. Sorry, Patrick. These people became a big part of, who we were and how we presented ourselves,
Right.
how we represented ourselves, because we weren't waiting for any of the mainstream publications to break a story that we felt was valuable. you know
Yeah.
if anything, they were watching us,
Mm-hmm.
because they were like, oh, okay, okay, I see you, that kind of thing. And if they were fronting, we also had people who wrote opinion columns in the magazine
Mm-hmm.
that didn't mind taking a shot at something that they thought was inappropriate or racist. So that became part of our energy. I still remember to this day um, we had Malcolm X on the cover
Mm.
of Word magazine, and we started getting some hate mail as a result of that.
Mm.
So it just shows you the breadth, of what Word was dealing with at the time. And I felt very confident having worked at CBC television, so there was no sense of, you know, fear. And I felt if I could do what I was doing at CBC, I certainly could do that at Word Magazine, which was, in my view, for the benefit of the community.
Yeah, no, and I feel like I've told you before, I used to get Word magazine from Lucky's Barbershop on St. Clair, and I always enjoyed looking through the artist profiles and all the different stories that were there. I'm wondering, did you ever have like a favorite interview that you did, or a favorite artist that you profiled, or artists throughout those 25 years?
I'd have to say yes. Um, for me, there's a journalism phrase that we use called a big get.
Mm.
And for me, um, the biggest get for me was getting the opportunity to interview Quincy Jones.
Mm.
I, after interviewing Quincy Jones, not only was I very excited about this interview, but getting to sit down with this man and talk about his greatness and what drove him and what his philosophy was. I mean, I still to this day remember um, asking him this question. I said, Quincy, what is your secret? Because here was a guy who was played all kinds of Black music. Was comfortable writing music for films. Working with Michael Jackson and all these other people, and the range, Count Basie, Frank Sinatra. I'm like, dude, how do you do it? And, you know, first of all, you got to be passionate, he says, but the other thing that he said to me that stays with me to this very day, he says, look, you do the best you can and then leave room for God.
Mm.
And I never forgot that. It's like, here was a guy saying, look, sometimes you put your all in, and if magic happens, then magic happens. You know what I mean?
Right.
You can't guarantee it, but you can create the conditions by being your best.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So that interview for me was the most exciting interview, because we didn't just talk about music. We also talked about technology and how technology had transformed the music and was continuing to transform the music, and staying in touch with the culture to the point where he could work with rappers, he could work with jazz musicians, he
Mm-hmm.
could work with Hollywood. That depth and breadth of his experience, the We Are the World, coordinating those guys on a song must have been like herding cats. And these are all superstars. So I am a huge, huge fan of Quincy. And for me, that was, the best time I had interviewing, anyone.
Wow, wow. Did you have any Canadian hip hop artists that you loved interviewing or even enjoyed their music?
Well, I sense you're trying to have me go on record there, to say who I liked and I didn't like. No,
No,
it
I want to
doesn't.
know who you liked. Who you
Uh,
liked.
I'm, I'm, I'm,
We don't
I'm
want
not
no
gonna
beef.
touch. I'm not gonna touch that one simply because we're working on the Canada Black Music Archives,
Okay.
and it's our way. It's a gift to the Canadian Black music scene, in my view, because I've always felt very strongly that you know we never got our due in terms of, and I'm talking now as being part of the music industry.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Black musicians never got their just desserts in terms of the work they did, the quality of the work they did, the exposure that it should have received,
Mm-hmm.
because structurally, um, you know, Black music from Canadian Black artists wasn't meant to succeed. And I say that, and it might sound controversial, because, if you're a pop artist or if you're a rock artist, the opportunities would be there and be there in spades. Less so for Black artists. And at some point, I'm sure you guys will interview Maestro, where he can talk about what those years were like, for him as an artist, you know, literally moving to New York and trying to make a go of it. That speaks volumes. So yeah, it's one of those things where I felt perhaps the most impactful, um, two of the most impactful things that I remember from those years of hip hop, was, Maestro getting played on pop music radio with Let Your Backbone Slide. That was a genuine moment and a genuine breakthrough, you know. And on that journey, I remember the Rascals, refusing
Mm,
to, accept their Junos
right.
because they were being relegated away from the television broadcast. And we covered that story, we wrote about that story. We were all feeling the same sense of, like, what the heck is this? I mean,
Mhm.
come on. This is the cutting edge. You would think you want to embrace this, and yet that wasn't happening. So, those two experiences, and Allison, when Allison made that documentary about the rap group that her brother was involved in, um, you know, that to me was a moment, because it really, that film really captured, um, you know, the struggles, the difficulties that, rap artists were having to deal with in this country. I mean, even the very idea of touring as a rap act in Canada, I mean, that was virtually impossible. First, for geographical reasons, but it went beyond that. It was about, venue owners not really feeling comfortable with having rap music in
Right.
their venues. So there was a lot of, yes, there was excitements, and
Mm,
things were changing, and yes, there was pushback against some of these restrictions, and obviously there were structurally racist things
right.
that impeded the growth of rap and hip hop culture. But I don't think people, there was no giving up. People felt this is who they are and this is how they want to represent themselves. And there was a time where, for me, anyways, I didn't want my favorite artist to be the most popular artist, because I didn't want to share
Mm,
my favorite artist with everybody. That was my thing, so, if I'm going to listen to a particular artist, yeah, it's like, if you enjoy a bottle of wine, you don't want everybody drinking that same bottle of wine.
true, true.
So that was for me. That's why I wouldn't say who I enjoyed more than the other, because I think there are a lot of people that, didn't become superstars, not because they weren't talented, but, there are a lot of ingredients that go into you becoming a star.
Right.
Whether you're acting or whether you're, performing music or any of that. I constantly say teamwork makes the dream work, and your
Mhm.
team is just as important as your talent.
That's true. That's true. That's a great analogy for sure. We have about only 25 minutes left. So imagine how the time goes by. But I wanted to ask you something because you talked a lot about the challenges that a lot of Canadian hip hop artists were facing during that time, such as touring. But I can also imagine that Word Magazine also went through some challenges. So I wanted to know, like, what were some of the challenges that Word Magazine, you and Donna as publishers faced during that time? And like what ultimately made you want to hang up the towel when it came to Word?
Well, I'll get to hanging up the towel lastly, but the challenges for any Black publication at the time, us included, was when you are having to rely on advertising and
Mhm.
not subscription, when you're having to be a free publication and having to generate advertising, sufficient advertising to, continue to publish and publish successfully, that became, I think, our biggest challenge.
Okay.
Not the content, not how we represented, for the community and all of that. The advertising community did not see the Black community as a priority community in terms of wanting or needing to advertise. And that was to me the most difficult part of the conversation that I had when I went to advertising agencies and made a pitch about advertising in our publication. It really wasn't just a Word thing, because Word had its fair share of success, where maybe only about 10% of the ad revenues that we generated at the time came from the Black community.
Mhm.
Um, that's a whole other story as to why that was, but we were constantly, pushing, those in the cultural community that were presenting Harlem Boys Choir or,
Mhm.
all these big productions that came here. From time to time, a South African production might come through, or, you know, uh, dance theater company of so and so might come through. Harborfront might be doing something. Roy Thompson Hall. These were um, places and spaces that featured our culture, but had to be persuaded to use the vehicles to promote those same events. So that took some effort to try and persuade them and to show them that, we were at the forefront of covering these things, and you needed to, show some appreciation.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, that sounds, it's like very real. That's like a real example of just how the struggle for a lot of Black publications, especially in this country where it seems like, there's always these barriers, and it always seems like they're trying to erase our impact and our presence here. But, there's so many publications such as Word and so many others, and Share and Pride, and so many others that have been making impact, especially in terms of, our voices. And I feel like Word was so versatile. I definitely, from reading it as a teenager, it gave a lot of youthful energy as well. And I loved that I could see, read a cover story on Elephant Man and read about Allison Seeley Smith, or look at a review of The Kink in My Hair or something like that. I just loved how it was just like our culture. You can get all aspects of our culture and who we were in just like an issue. If anyone has any questions for the Q&A session, please feel free to put it in the chat. One thing I wanted to build up upon, Phil, was this idea, like, did you ever feel that Word magazine was ever accepted by like Canadian society, or just, do you feel like you all got your flowers, or you were accepted or and looked at as a reputable media company?
Well, I never felt, I never felt that we were not accepted, because some of the same writers, some of the same visual artists, some of the same photographers that we featured later became, freelance contributors to those same mainstream news organizations.
Mhm.
And that happened, you know, um, that happened across the board, so we were embraced for that reason, because, the quality was there. We were embraced because we were doing things before others did it. And we were doing it not just on a cultural tip. One of my favorite series in Word magazine, two of them really, was we had, he's now a professor in the US. He also co-founded Afrofest. And, he wrote, I'm trying to, Thaddy Olson, Dr. Thaddy Olson. And Thaddy at the time and Sam created Afrofest. Okay, and for those of you who don't know the roots of Afrofest, it was Thaddy and Sam Mensa that
Mhm.
actually created that organization, and to this day, it's still one of the most exciting summer events that you can visit. But he wrote a piece. Thaddy wrote a three-part series on the slave castles of Africa,
Mm.
and it was going back and talking about how people were transported to those slave castles, particularly in Ghana, and were chained and then transported, and across the Atlantic. That series had a major, major impact on the readers of Word Magazine at the time because, first of all, no one had ever tackled it quite that way.
Mm.
And secondly, what made it really stand out for me, it wasn't coming through the lens of an outsider.
Right.
This was a Ghanaian, who himself was a medical professional, saying this is what that experience was like. You know, another story that we did a multi-part series on AIDS as it was starting to ravage certain African countries. And we sent one of our writers, Garth Hardy, to cover the story in a multi-part series. He went to Uganda, he went to South Africa, and he went to Kenya, and wrote a multi-part series. And we jumped out on this long before um, any other publication was doing at the time. And it when you talk about Word wasn't just one thing, to me that was the exciting part of it,
Yes.
because we could speak to that, and we could also speak to you know um, Bob Marley, and why Redemption Song was such an impressive, was an impressive piece of work. you
Mhm.
know and we crossed all the barriers and touched all the different areas of Black culture. Youssou N'Dour, one of
Mhm.
my favorite African artists. We had writers from the continent that can write from the inside about who these artists were. And my thing was, if Toronto is the most culturally diverse place on the planet, then we should have the most exciting stories reflecting Black life on the planet.
Mhm.
And we didn't want people to write about it the way you might for the Toronto Star, the way you might for the Globe and Mail, the way you might for the Toronto Sun. We were always saying to our writers, we want wit, we want insight, and we want edge.
Mm.
So you weren't going to be bored picking it up and reading it.
Most
and that's
definitely.
and that's how we kind of differentiated ourselves from the competition.
No, that I appreciate that, Brandon, because I definitely felt that in reading your issues and things like that. So we're now going to move into our Q&A portion. But if anyone has any questions, please put it in the chat, and we'll definitely get it answered. I see one question in the chat from Kiana that says, on the topic of Black pride in Latin America, what do you think we could learn from their Black movements and vice versa? So I guess she's referring to when you were talking about how you were inspired by Afro-Brazilian culture, and how that when you came back, that inspired you to start Word.
Well, I was fortunate enough when I was at university to have taken some courses on the history of Latin America, history of South America, really.
Mhm.
and got exposed to Brazilian culture, and also fell in love with the music,
Mm.
you know and so that's how I ended up, because of that passion for the culture, ended up not going to a Caribbean island on my honeymoon, but instead trekking it to you know northeastern Brazil. And so going there and seeing this energy, this vibe, that was happening culturally, musically, and all of that, I felt like I was privy to some things that most other people weren't.
Right.
So I wanted to share this, and I came back probably as some excited, person yakking and yakking away about how this was very cool.
Mhm.
And it was more than a beach. It was more than, you know, um, sunshine and women in bikinis and that kind of thing.
Right.
So it got me closer to learning about Afro-Brazilian culture, and I wanted to share the music. So every chance we got to preview some of the stuff, write about some of the stuff, we did that. Um, and it was just about tapping into the buzz and excitement that didn't just happen here in North America, but could come from the continent of Africa, could come from Europe, or could come from any other part of the world where there was, a genuine
Right.
diasporic Black culture. To
Right.
me, that's the most exciting thing in the world, to be able to, and this is my dream, to be able to travel and capture some of that excitement, because
Mhm.
we don't know ourselves really. When you think about what's out there, we don't know ourselves, because our history has been hidden from us. Our culture has been hidden from us. So,
Right.
the more you learn, the more excited you get about it, and the more you want to share it. And that's how I felt.
Yeah, no, I think that's so valid. Our next question is from Casey, and she asks is, what advice would you have for those looking to build a similar publication to Word that uplifts Blackness in these current times?
Um, Go to the web.
Okay.
That's the first thing that I would say. You know, um, if you look around you, how often do you spend your time picking up a newspaper or magazine versus, being on social media, or getting online at your favorite website? It's the new normal.
Mhm.
And I have two daughters who are millennials, and I notice that they get their information um, online, and they weren't picking up a newspaper. I used to read three newspapers every day, and had subscriptions to various magazines and whatnot. Over time, I just decided, let me just go on their website and read a story. And I got access to even more information. So, my advice to anybody trying to do what we did back then, is to consider the online space as a space through which you'll do it.
Mhm.
And the benefit of doing that, um, it's you're not you're not limited to words.
Mhm.
Okay. It's a multimedia experience, and it's becoming an immersive experience, with all kinds of changes that are going on. So yeah, I would say that if anybody was starting something like that today, you'd have to seriously question why you would want to do it in print,
Mhm.
when we've seen so many print publications die after being around for many, many years. It's not readership that's the problem, I believe. It's revenues. And we know now that 80% of the advertising revenues is being gobbled up by Google and Facebook online.
Yeah, that's true.
So what is left for a small independent publication? If you can assure yourself of a subscription base plus advertising, then maybe you're onto something. But you also have to keep your eye on the long term, which is where the trends are going. How is it trending? And stay abreast of what's going on and pay attention to Google Trends.
Yeah, those sound like awesome, relevant advice for sure. Yeah, the next question, and if anyone has any more questions, definitely put it in the chat. And thank you to everyone who's been putting down their questions. Dial Media and Communication wants to know, I'm interested in hearing about the emotional feeling of walking away from Word, assuming it was an emotional goodbye. What was the moment when you knew it was time to end the chapter and begin something new? Which was similar to what I wanted to ask earlier, which was how did you know you wanted to end Word?
Yeah, try to skip that, and Deo decided she'd come back and ask. Okay. Because it was painful,
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
it's, it was like our first baby, you know
Mm,
what I mean? And you put your heart and soul into it, you know, 20 plus years into something that came to, define a period, you know what I mean? Um, I couldn't go anywhere without conversations being started about Word and what do you think of this story or that story, or why aren't you guys doing this or doing that? And, you know, the part that I had to look at being a publisher was the part that few people who wanted to see Word stay around for much longer tend to look at. And that was, I had to look at the business case. you
mm,
know, Donna especially, she, was our business manager, and she and I would talk about, where we were in terms of advertising revenues, which we had seen starting to taper off, even with the music industry, which was about, I'd say about 60% of our editorial was about music.
mm.
And so we saw the labels when they were starting to feel the impact of people stealing music online and all of that, they stopped advertising because they weren't selling as much music. And since they were our biggest advertiser at the time, as I said, maybe about 10% of our advertising came from the Black community.
Mhm.
Um, we started seeing the writing on the wall, and we started saying at a certain point, um, no matter how much we are in love with the idea of keeping Word going, we had to respond to that piece. And that piece says when your major advertisers sneezes, then you're going to catch a cold.
Mm, mm,
So we got out before a lot of others, got out. And, I look back and you see now where iWeekly never stayed around, and they were founded by the folks at the Toronto Star. And that underscored why we did what we did in the eyes of a lot of people. And as you saw over the last few years, Now Magazine became a fraction of what Now Magazine was back in the day,
right. Yeah.
eventually being sold for a fraction of what it would have been worth had they sold it in its heyday. So, we recognized, we read the tea leaves and decided as a small independent publication, we
Mhm.
had to pivot. And fortunately for us, we were also producing the Toronto Urban Music Festival and then later the Irie Music Festival.
Okay.
So again, music a friend of mine used to use the term music is the answer. Well,
Mhm.
for us, music became the answer once again, because we could still reflect the culture through music and visual arts and,
Mm.
panel discussions and conversations and that kind of thing. So we were able to pivot that way, which, reduced the sting a little bit of
Yeah,
having to close shop.
right.
And we felt that we could still do some of the work that we were doing just in a different form. So when we went to producing festivals, our motto became from the page to the stage.
Mm. Wow. I love that. I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, you know what? It's so interesting how you explained that you just really just pivoted from like print to now like actually producing music festivals. So I thought that was so interesting, and it made, yeah, that was such a highlight. I never thought of it in that way, but how you put it, it actually makes a lot of sense. So you're not actually that far removed from what you were doing before with words. So
Absolutely not, because again, like I said, at least 60% of our coverage dealt with music.
right.
So I was still, in a sense, operating in music. And, with our music festival, we had spoken word. So there's another element,
Hmm.
performance, also being a part of it, and literature. There were, for a number of years when we produced, the Irie Music Festival, there was a literary component that we brought to the table, unlike a lot of other festivals at the time.
Okay. Yeah.
you know, and visual arts. We used um, these the city of Toronto inside the rotunda. We presented several art exhibits, where for a week to 2 weeks we presented a number of visual artists from our community being
Hmm.
showcased inside while the Ari Music Festival took place outside at Nathan Phillips Square, ending up at Queen's Park, where we had, conferences dealing with the environment. So it was a different kind of programming. It wasn't just presented in a print
Right.
format.
That's so interesting. That's really interesting. Okay. Our last question is from Jess, and she says, this has been amazing. What advice would you have for emerging music journalists who are interested in interviewing artists?
Um, I think in many ways it is easier now, um, to be a successful writer, um, and journalist, because you know the world of podcasting, the world of blogging has really opened up a lot of opportunities, whereby if you're good at what you do,
Hmm.
people will find you. So if you have a blog and you're writing interesting stories, then artists will want to talk to you. You
Hmm.
know what I mean? Because you're giving them a platform. They are, um, honored or comfortable sitting down and talking to you, because you're telling their story.
Right. Right.
And I think, the podcast piece is also very exciting,
Yeah.
because there you go. If you want to, have that interview with your favorite artist, one component becomes the podcast, the other component becomes the blog.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? It becomes a lot more interesting and exciting. And then you've got the social media piece, where increasingly you see people chopping things up into smaller bits and bytes. So
Right.
it's way more exciting than my day. You know what I mean? Back in the day, yes, you have to spend a lot more energy, a lot more time staying relevant and staying current. There's no doubt about that.
Hmm.
That's the big challenge. You got to stay current. And if you're stale, people simply go to the next site. So I
Right.
think it's harder work, but the rewards I think are bigger, and it's much more exciting times because now I think 2020, we're going to look back at 2020 and say we were part of the largest civil rights movement of the 21st century. And I'm talking about, you know, the BLM protest
Right.
following the George Floyd murder and all the other things that were on people's minds. Certainly, the biggest of which was a pandemic, and we saw unequal
Yeah.
um, treatment of
Mm-hmm.
people on the front lines. So there was a kind of consciousness raising that was going on during the pandemic. And now I think the broader community understands that um, there's not much going on in terms of inclusiveness, or we could do much more.
Right.
And we also have to tackle the issue of equity. And so that moment has spawned a lot of what I'd call ripple effects,
Right.
where if you don't know by now, you won't know, that,
True.
there's inequality and the fight is for inclusiveness and fairness and all of that. So everybody's aware. So you've got a platform where everybody understands that more needs to be done, then you can't complain
Right.
if you don't see the change you seek. Be the change you seek,
Mm-hmm.
because the opportunity is greater now than ever before, despite what you see sometimes on the news. And this is coming from someone who's worked in the news business for over 20 plus years.
Right.
Take time out. If it gets heavy, turn it off.
Mm-hmm.
Take a week away and just, because the other the other thing we don't talk about in this era and during this time is the mental health impacts of
Right.
the pandemic. And if I was still publishing a magazine, in as much as there's been great music that has come out of the pandemic, um, the health impacts has created what I consider to be an epidemic of its own.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm starting to see more Black folks becoming conscious about having open conversations about our collective mental health
Yes. Yes.
and our individual mental health.
Yes.
So to me, is there a more exciting time? There's more than enough to write about if you really want to be about it. If you want to tell stories visually, there's lots of stories to be told. So, you and I spoke briefly about this. We can't sit and wait for someone to deliver it on our plate and say, here you go.
Exactly. Exactly.
You got to go get it,
Yes. Yes.
and my thing is, if it's important to you, go get it.
Mhm. If it's important to you, go get it. I think that's like a perfect way to end this conversation. Phil, there's just no words to describe how grateful we are that you were able to join us this evening, for us to remember about the impact of Word Magazine and how important it is for us to tell our stories and to, tell our histories. So thank you on behalf of the BABA team. Thank you so much for joining us, Phil. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks to Alana as well,
Yes.
who's behind the scenes. And, I got a chance to meet you both on Zoom. And, one thing I'll say to all of you guys that are part of this, discussion, conversation, what have you, um, is that we often don't realize that what we do is having an impact, you know, until much, much later. And I had opportunities when I was going through college, going through university, in high school, going back to high school, where I had community mentors,
Right.
people from my community who cared enough to sit down and have conversations and mentor people and, start youth organizations. Some of the youth organizations that I was a part of had huge impacts on me. And
Mm-hmm.
that's, you know, there's a continuity there. There's a tradition of each one reach one, teach one, and paying it forward, because years later, you're going to come across a John Saba who says, I used to go to Lucky, who was my barber, by the way. Okay, go to a Lucky barbershop and end up picking up a magazine, which brings us back to this moment.
Exactly, exactly. These are so important. No, for sure. No, thank you for that. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Like, we really appreciated your presence, and we hope that this talk was impactful and it brought some memories for those in the chat. Some people were mentioning, are just thanking you, Phil, for the lovely conversation. Our next event is going to be on June 24th at 6:30 p.m. We will release details next week on our social media channels. So you can definitely follow Building a Black Archive on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, as well as LinkedIn as well. Phil, if people wanted to keep in touch with you or to reach out to you, how can they reach out to you?
Well, these days, and I know I'll get my knuckles rapped for never having mentioned it. These days, our latest initiative, I should say, and the one that I'll probably do until I'm retired and, you know, sitting in a rocking chair, is the Canada Black Music Archive. And I'll just say very briefly, for those of you who don't know anything about it, it's because we haven't gone public with it as yet.
Sure.
But for the last year, we've been working with some recent graduates from college and university, working on what will become a national Black music archive, going from the 1800s to the current times.
Wow.
There are a lot of people out there who have done amazing things as artists, as musicians, as club owners, as radio station owners, as hosts, label managers, that have made a huge contribution to the point now where we can look and say Drake and The Weeknd are two of the biggest artists in the world. Well, nobody will argue that, but how did we get here?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And that's the story that I want to tell with the National Black Music Archive, is to chase down these stories and to give people a knowledge of, Portia White out of Halifax, and
Mm-hmm.
what she was doing as a singer, opera singer, or most people know about the great pianist Oscar Peterson,
Yes.
you know, or the first reggae band to be signed by a major label, Messenger, or the incredible female singers from the continent that have lived in Toronto or lived in Montreal. And then we can go all the way back to Nathaniel Dett, who was a superstar back in the 1800s. He came out of St. Catharines. So there's a lot of interesting stories there to be told. It's choirs, it's blues musicians, it's hip hop, it's reggae, it's all the various genres that comes out of the continent. So I'm excited about sharing that information digitally,
Okay.
on an archive. And for the last year, we've had 12 interns doing the research, the initial research. We hope to be able to launch the first version of this site this year, and we're continuing to do the research. We're going to be opening it up to the public because I know there's a lot of information out there that we don't yet know of,
Right.
but we'll come to learn. And, we're looking for partners in the struggle, as it were, to gather this information, because the honest to God truth is that Library and Archives Canada and the National Music Center has left some, massive holes in terms of telling that story. And I think it's incumbent on us to tell our own stories.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, please keep us in the loop and let us know when that launches, because I'm sure everyone here would love to like support and share that archive, especially our team too. So please keep us on in the loop on that. Or
Well,
like, do you
thank
have
you.
an email list or an email that people
Well,
can reach out to?
they can reach me at phil.vassell@gmail. That's very easy to remember.
Okay.
phil.vassell@gmail. And as I said, we're going to be working on setting up a newsletter
Okay.
and an information channel using the newsletter, so people who are interested can, participate or simply spread the word. And it is a community initiative. It is us saying, look, this matters. And that's the story that we want to share. And like I said, these guys didn't come out of nowhere.
Exactly.
If they stand tall, they were standing on the shoulders of Nathaniel Dett, who goes back to the 1800s.
This is so exciting. We're looking forward to that. So Phil's email is in the chat if anyone wants to connect with him and get on the list for when that archive launches. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Phil. We appreciate that. And we hope that everyone has a good night.
Thank you very much. And to everybody else who came out for this, big thank you. Stay safe. And hopefully we'll connect sometime soon. Take care.
Absolutely. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.